Hey guys, tonight we begin with the jobs that nobody talks about when they talk about slavery. Not the cotton fields, though those were brutal enough. We're going deeper into the work that was so dangerous, so deadly, so fundamentally destructive to human bodies that enslavers sometimes hesitated to risk their own property on it. Sometimes. Other times, they calculated that black lives were cheap enough to spend on tasks that would kill, and they spent them freely. These were the jobs that maimed and murdered, that shortened lives measured in months rather than years, that turned human beings into disposable tools for the most hazardous work the antebellum economy required. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe. Turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the sugar plantations of Louisiana, because if you want to understand dangerous work during slavery, you need to understand sugar. Cotton gets all the attention in the history books, but sugar was worse. Sugar was a killing machine that consumed human bodies with an efficiency that horrified even observers who were used to the brutalities of slavery. The work was harder, the hours longer, the mortality higher. Enslaved people on sugar plantations died at rates that prevented the population from reproducing itself. More people died than were born, year after year, and the only way to maintain the workforce was to keep importing more people to die. The sugar harvest, called the grinding season, was a nightmare that lasted from October through December, sometimes longer. The cane had to be cut and processed quickly once it was ready, because delay meant the sugar content dropped, meant profits disappeared, meant the whole year's work was wasted. So when grinding season came, the plantation became a factory that never stopped, running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for months at a time. You worked in shifts, but the shifts could be 18 hours, 20 hours, with barely enough time to eat and collapse before you were called back to the fields or the sugar house. The cutting itself was brutal labor. You swung a machete through thick cane stalks hour after hour, the leaves sharp enough to slice skin, the sun beating down, the humidity making every breath feel like drowning. The cane grew 10, 12, 15 feet tall, and you cut it at the base, stripped the leaves, loaded it onto carts, and moved to the next row. The pace was relentless because the whole operation depended on keeping the sugar house supplied. Fall behind in the fields, and the grinding machinery sat idle. And idle machinery meant angry overseers. And angry overseers meant the whip. But the real danger was in the sugar house, where the cane was processed into the crystals that would be shipped to markets across the world. The sugar house was a factory before factories existed, a maze of machinery and boiling vats and open flames that would have been dangerous even with modern safety equipment. With enslaved workers who had no protection, no training, no recourse when things went wrong, it was a death trap. The machinery that crushed the cane had massive rollers that could grab a hand, an arm, a body, and pull it through before anyone could react. The standard safety equipment was a hatchet kept nearby, so that a caught limb could be chopped off before the whole person was dragged into the machinery. Think about that. The safety plan was amputation. The boiling houses were worse in different ways. The cane juice had to be boiled down in a series of massive kettles, each one hotter than the last. The liquid bubbling and steaming. The heat so intense that workers stripped to the waist and still dripped with sweat. One slip, one stumble, one moment of exhaustion-induced clumsiness, and you fell into boiling sugar that would cook the flesh from your bones before anyone could pull you out. Even without falling in, the burns were constant. Splashes and spills leaving scars that mapped careers in the sugar house. The fumes were toxic. The air thick with steam that scalded lungs. The heat so oppressive that men collapsed and sometimes didn't get up. The workers who tended the kettles did so around the clock during grinding season, monitoring temperatures, skimming impurities, transferring liquid from kettle to kettle at precisely the right moments. The work required skill and constant attention, performed by people who were exhausted beyond description, who had been working for days with minimal sleep, whose bodies were breaking down from the combination of heat and labor and insufficient food. The sugar boiler was a skilled position, one of the most important jobs on the plantation. But the skill didn't come with protection from the dangers. Mistakes happened, and mistakes in the boiling house meant injuries that could kill slowly over weeks as infections set in, as burns refused to heal, as bodies already weakened by overwork succumbed to damage they might have survived under better conditions. The children worked in the sugar houses too, because slavery didn't spare the young from dangerous labor. Boys as young as 10 or 12 were put to work feeding cane into the rollers, their small hands considered more nimble, their small bodies more able to reach into the machinery to clear jams. They worked alongside adults through the endless shifts of grinding season, their bodies not yet fully developed being pushed to adult limits, their reflexes not yet fully honed being trusted to avoid machinery that killed adults regularly. The children who survived learned the trade, but many didn't survive, their deaths recorded in the same matter-of-fact way as any other property loss. The sugar houses themselves were architectural nightmares. Buildings designed for production with no consideration for the people who would work inside them. The roofs were often inadequate, letting in rain that made floors slippery, that added to the humidity, that created conditions where falls were more likely and burns more frequent. The lighting came from the fires under the kettles and whatever lamps could be maintained in the steam and heat, leaving shadows where dangers lurked, making it harder to see the hazards that were everywhere. The ventilation was almost non-existent, the air inside thick with steam and fumes, the temperature often exceeding what human bodies could safely endure for hours at a time. The mortality statistics tell the story in numbers that should shock but somehow don't, because we've been taught to accept the horrors of slavery as historical background rather than ongoing atrocity. Sugar parishes in Louisiana had death rates among enslaved people that exceeded birth rates by significant margins, sometimes by 10% or more each year. The population dropped steadily unless new people were brought in. Enslavers knew this, calculated it into their business models, decided that working people to death and buying replacements was more profitable than treating workers well enough to survive. Some sugar planters openly discussed the economics of replacement versus preservation, putting numbers to the value of human life and finding that human life came up cheap. The sugar plantation was designed to kill, and it worked exactly as designed. The profit margins were calculated on the assumption of high mortality. The work schedules were set knowing that workers would break down. The safety measures were minimal because safety measures cost money and dead workers could be replaced. This wasn't accidental cruelty or the unfortunate side effect of difficult work. It was a business model built on the assumption that certain categories of human beings were disposable, that their lives could be spent like any other input, that their deaths were simply a cost of production. Now let's talk about the rice plantations of the Carolina and Georgia Low Country, because rice had its own particular horrors. The rice fields were carved out of coastal swamps. landscapes of water and mud and disease that kill through different mechanisms than sugar, but kill just as surely. The work began with creating the fields themselves, clearing swamps, building dikes and canals, shaping the landscape to control the flow of water that rice cultivation required. This was some of the most physically demanding work in all of American slavery, performed in conditions that seemed designed to destroy human bodies. You stood in water for hours at a time, sometimes waist deep, sometimes deeper. The mud sucked at your feet with every step, making movement exhausting. The sun beat down on your head, while the water kept your lower body in a different temperature zone, the combination confusing your body's ability to regulate itself. The insects were relentless, clouds of mosquitoes and flies that bit exposed skin constantly, that carried diseases you didn't understand, but that would kill you just the same. Malaria was endemic in the rice country, the mosquitoes breeding in the same standing water where you worked, the parasites entering your blood through bites you couldn't prevent. The rice itself had to be planted by hand, each seedling pushed into the mud at the proper depth and spacing, hour after hour of bending and reaching in water that might contain snakes, alligators, or nothing more dangerous than the leeches that attached to your legs and had to be pulled off at the end of each day. The weeding was worse, requiring you to distinguish rice plants from weeds while standing in murky water where you couldn't see what your hands were touching. The harvest meant cutting rice, stalks with sickles, bundling them, carrying them to higher ground, all while the water pulled at every movement and the mud tried to claim your feet with every step. The disease environment of the rice plantations was catastrophic. Malaria killed some people quickly and debilitated others for years, the recurring fevers draining strength, making other work harder, leaving victims vulnerable to other diseases that a healthy body might have fought off. Yellow fever came in epidemics that could kill dozens on a single plantation in a matter of weeks. Dysentery spread through water supplies contaminated by the same swamps where people worked. Respiratory infections flourished in the damp conditions. The combination of standing water, physical exhaustion, and minimal medical care created death rates that rivaled the sugar plantations. Enslaved rice workers developed some resistance to malaria over generations, a grim adaptation that made them more valuable to enslavers precisely because they could survive conditions that killed white workers and even enslaved people from other regions. This resistance was partial and imperfect, still leaving people vulnerable to the disease's worst effects, but it was enough to make Carolina rice planters specifically seek out workers from malaria-endemic regions of Africa. The survival advantage became another form of exploitation, another way that black bodies were used and valued only for what they could produce. Let's descend into the earth now, into the mines where enslaved people extracted the minerals that fueled early American industry. Mining was dangerous work everywhere in the world, but mining with enslaved labor combined industrial hazards with the complete disregard for human life that characterized slavery. The gold mines of the Carolina Piedmont, the lead mines of Missouri, the iron mines of Virginia, the coal mines of Kentucky and Virginia, the salt mines of Louisiana and Virginia, all of them consumed enslaved, workers in conditions that would be criminal today and were simply normal then. The gold mines were often placer operations, requiring workers to stand in cold streams sifting through gravel for flakes of gold, the water numbing legs and feet, the repetitive motion straining backs and shoulders, the hours stretching until the light failed. But the more productive mines went underground, following veins of ore through tunnels that were never built with safety in mind. The shafts were narrow and poorly ventilated, the air thick with dust that would eventually destroy lungs, the lighting minimal, the risk of collapse ever present. Enslaved miners worked with picks and shovels, breaking rock by hand, loading it into baskets or carts, hauling it to the surface for processing. The work was exhausting even in good conditions, and conditions in the mines were never good. The darkness underground was absolute once you moved away from the shaft entrance. The candles and lamps that provided light were unreliable, prone to going out, leaving workers in blackness so complete they couldn't see their hands in front of their faces. Working in that darkness meant relying on touch and sound, feeling for the seam of ore, listening for the creak of timbers that might signal an impending collapse, developing senses that could mean the difference between life and death. The isolation was psychological torture. Hours spent in narrow passages far from sunlight, far from fresh air, far from anything that felt like the world above. Cave-ins killed miners without warning, the earth simply collapsing, burying men under tons of rock that might take days to move. The sound of a collapse was a roar followed by silence, the dust settling slowly in the aftermath, the survivors calling out to learn who had been caught. Some survived these collapses, trapped in small spaces, waiting for rescue that might or might not come, dying of thirst or suffocation while rescuers dug frantically to reach them. Others died instantly, their bodies crushed beyond recognition, their deaths noted in plantation records as losses of property rather than losses of human life. The flooding was equally dangerous, water seeping into shafts from underground streams, rising faster than the primitive pumps could remove it, drowning miners who couldn't escape quickly enough through tunnels that filled from the bottom up. The iron furnaces of Virginia represented a different kind of industrial danger, the danger of working with materials at temperatures that could destroy human flesh in an instant. The Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond was one of the largest industrial operations in the South, and it relied heavily on enslaved labor for the most dangerous jobs, the jobs that free workers might refuse or demand premium wages to perform. The furnaces ran at temperatures that could melt metal, tended by workers who had no protective equipment, who suffered burns with terrible regularity, who breathed air thick with smoke and metal particles that accumulated in their lungs over years. The casting process required pouring molten iron into molds, work where a single splash could cause injuries that would never fully heal, where the metal glowed white hot and flowed like deadly water. Men lost fingers, hands, arms to the machinery that processed the iron. They lost eyes to flying sparks that could cross a room in an instant. They lost lungs to the fumes that filled the foundry, the air so thick with particles that workers coughed constantly, that breathing became labored, that the damage accumulated invisibly until it couldn't be ignored. The iron industry needed bodies, and slavery provided them at a price that made safety investments seem wasteful. The turpentine industry of the Carolina pine forests combined physical danger with chemical exposure in ways that shortened lives even when they didn't end them suddenly. Turpentine production required cutting into living pine trees to collect the resin that oozed from the wounds, a process called tapping that had to be repeated throughout the harvest season. The work itself was physically demanding, requiring workers to cut thousands of trees, to collect resin in containers, to transport heavy barrels through forests with no roads. But the real danger was the turpentine itself, a chemical that penetrated skin, that damaged lungs when breathed, that accumulated in bodies over years of exposure. The distilleries where raw resin was processed into turpentine and rosin were hazardous in more immediate ways. The stills were heated by open fires, the resin highly flammable, explosions and fires a regular occurrence. Workers suffered burns from splashing turpentine, from fires that spread faster than they could escape, from explosions that sent debris flying through confined spaces. The fumes in the distilleries were intense, the chemicals irritating eyes and throats, causing headaches and dizziness that could lead to accidents, building up in bodies until the damage became permanent. Turpentine workers developed distinctive health problems, their bodies marked by the chemical that made their labor valuable. The construction of railroads and canals put enslaved workers in some of the most dangerous environments in antebellum America. These massive infrastructure projects required moving earth on a scale that had never been attempted before, and they consumed human lives with proportional voracity. The digging was done by hand, with picks and shovels and wheelbarrows, in trenches that could collapse without warning, in swamps that bred disease, in conditions that would have been dangerous even with modern equipment and safety standards. The project stretched for miles, through every kind of terrain, and the workers moved with them, living in temporary camps that offered none of the stability or minimal comfort of plantation life. Canal construction was particularly deadly, the work combining the dangers of excavation with the disease environment of swampland. The canals that connected American waterways required cutting through miles of terrain, much of it swampy, all of it requiring removal by human labor. Workers stood in water and mud for hours at a time, digging channels, building locks, creating the infrastructure that would carry commerce across regions. The disease environment was similar to the rice plantations, malaria and yellow fever killing workers in numbers that forced constant replacement. The mosquitoes bred in the stagnant water of the construction sites, in the mud that workers churned, in the puddles that formed in every excavation. The Santee Canal in South Carolina was built with enslaved labor in the 1790s, its construction consuming workers at rates that shocked even contemporary observers. The dismal swamp canal between Virginia and North Carolina cut through some of the most disease-ridden territory on the eastern seaboard. The workers digging through muck that seemed bottomless, the water rising around them as they worked, the insects swarming in clouds so thick they darkened the air. The various canal projects in Louisiana were worse still, the subtropical climate adding heat to the other miseries. The diseases more virulent, the death tolls higher. All of these projects had mortality rates that should have been scandalous, but were simply accepted as the cost of progress, the price of connecting waterways, the expense of building an economy. Railroad construction added new dangers to the old ones, the technology of the railroad bringing new ways to die. The railroads required cutting through mountains, which meant blasting, which meant working with explosives that could detonate unexpectedly, that required precise timing and careful handling by workers who had no training and no protection. Black powder was unpredictable, the fuses unreliable, the science of demolition still being developed through trial and error, with the errors often fatal. Premature explosions killed workers, sent rocks flying that crushed and maimed, created conditions where a moment's inattention could be fatal, where even perfect attention might not be enough. The tunnels that carried railroads through mountains were dug by hand, pick and shovel work in confined spaces, the same cave-in risks as mining, the same bad air, the same darkness and danger, but stretching for miles through solid rock. The Blue Ridge Tunnel in Virginia was built largely by enslaved workers in the 1850s. Over 4,000 feet of mountain carved out by hand, the work taking years, the casualties never fully counted. Workers entered the mountain from both ends, digging toward the middle, meeting somewhere in the darkness if they survived long enough to meet. The air in the tunnels was foul, the dust choking, the rock sometimes releasing gases that could knock a man unconscious before he knew anything was wrong. The construction camps, where workers lived, during these projects were temporary and brutal. Collections of tents and shacks that offered shelter from rain but little else. Food was minimal. Whatever could be transported to remote locations and distributed to workers who had no choice about what they received. Shelter was inadequate, the structures thrown up quickly and maintained poorly, offering little protection from cold or heat. Medical care was non-existent except in the most serious cases, and even then it was rudimentary, focused on getting workers back to the job rather than actually healing them. Workers who fell ill or were injured were often simply left to die, replaced by new workers brought in to maintain the pace of construction, their deaths noted as setbacks to the schedule rather than tragedies. Lumbering in the forests of the South put enslaved workers against nature in its most unforgiving forms. The work combining physical danger with isolation that made every accident potentially fatal. The logging camps were deep in forests where accidents could happen far from any help, where injuries that might have been survivable with prompt treatment became fatal because treatment was hours or days away, where a broken leg or a deep cut could mean death, simply because there was no way to get care in time. The forests themselves were obstacles, the underbrush thick, the terrain uneven, the footing treacherous even before you started trying to fell trees that weighed tons. The work was dangerous at every stage, from the first cut to the final delivery. Felling massive trees required skill and luck in roughly equal measure. You cut a notch to direct the fall, you sawed through the trunk, and then you hoped the tree went where you expected. But trees were unpredictable, their weight distribution uneven, their branches catching on other trees, their falls sometimes reversing direction without warning. Workers who misjudged the trajectory were crushed. The weight of a falling tree more than enough to kill instantly, the forest suddenly silent except for the echo of the crash. Trimming branches from fallen trees was scarcely safer, the saw or axe slipping on resin-slick wood, cutting flesh instead of timber, the injuries severe and the treatment primitive. Transporting logs to rivers or mills added new dangers to those already survived. The logs were heavy beyond easy comprehension. Thousands of pounds of dead weight that had to be moved through forests with no roads, across terrain that fought every step of the way. Workers used mules and oxen, levers and chains, muscle and desperation to move timber that could crush anyone caught in the wrong position. Logs rolled unexpectedly. Chains snapped under tension. Animals panicked and dragged loads into workers who couldn't get out of the way. The forest claimed their toll at every stage of the process. The log drives that floated timber downstream to sawmills were among the most dramatic and dangerous work in the industry. Workers rode the logs through rapids and overfalls, using poles to keep the timber moving, to break up jams that could involve hundreds of logs tangled together in massive snarls that blocked the river. A man who fell into the water among moving logs was in immediate danger of being crushed, the heavy timber rolling and shifting with the current, leaving no safe space for a human body. The logs could pin you against rocks, could drive you under the surface, could break bones and tear flesh with their rough bark and their irresistible momentum. Drowning was common, the cold water and the weight of waterlogged clothing pulling workers under before they could reach safety. The current carrying bodies downstream to be found days later or never. The sawmills where logs became lumber had their own hazards, the machinery of the industrial age creating new ways to injure and kill. The blades that cut wood could cut flesh just as easily, and they did, regularly, taking fingers and hands and arms from workers who operated them for hours without rest. The machinery was crude by modern standards, powered by water or steam, with none of the guards or safety features that protect workers today. A moment's inattention, a slip on sawdust-covered floors, a board that kicked back unexpectedly, and you could lose a limb or a life. The sawmills ran on schedules that demanded maximum production, with enslaved workers pushed to maintain pace regardless of fatigue, regardless of the way exhaustion increased the likelihood of accidents that could end careers or lives. The maritime industries put enslaved workers on ships and docks, where the combination of heavy cargo, unsteady footing, and unforgiving water created constant danger. The ports of the South were busy places, ships arriving and departing constantly, cargo flowing in volumes that required armies of workers to handle. Enslaved stevedores loaded and unloaded ships throughout the region, handling bales of cotton that weighed 500 pounds, barrels of molasses and sugar, hogsheads of tobacco, crates of goods that could weigh hundreds of pounds each. The work required strength and skill, balancing on gangplanks that shifted with the tide, carrying loads that could throw you off balance, working in holes where cargo could shift and crush you against the hull. The docks themselves were treacherous, the planking often slick with water or oil, the edges unguarded, the water below unforgiving. Falls into the water between ship and dock killed stevedores who couldn't swim, and many couldn't. The ability to swim not being something that enslaved people had many opportunities to learn. They drowned in the narrow space where rescue was almost impossible. The ships pressing against the dock, the current pulling bodies under and away. Falls into holes broke bones and killed instantly when the drop was far enough. The landing on cargo or deck equally unforgiving. Cargo that came loose crushed workers beneath weights that no human body could withstand. The ropes that secured loads failing without warning. The work of hours becoming deadly projectiles in an instant. Ropes under tension were dangers that the inexperienced didn't fully appreciate until it was too late. A rope that snapped could whip across a deck faster than the eye could follow, cutting and killing anyone in its path. Chains that broke could do worse, the metal links becoming shrapnel. Workers learned to watch the tension, to feel the vibration that warned of impending failure, to position themselves out of the line of potential disaster. But the learning came through experience, through witnessing accidents, through narrowly avoiding disasters that claimed others. The docks were dangerous places for everyone who worked them, but enslaved workers had no choice about whether to accept the risk, no ability to refuse dangerous tasks, no compensation when things went wrong. Enslaved sailors faced the full range of maritime dangers, from storms that could send ships to the bottom to the daily hazards of working with ropes and rigging high above decks. Falls from masts were often fatal, the distance to the deck or water too great for survival. The work of climbing and handling sails done at heights that made any slip potentially deadly. Ropes and chains could catch fingers and hands, crushing or severing them in an instant. The machinery of sailing ships unforgiving of mistakes. Ships that foundered took their crews with them, enslaved and free drowning together when the sea claimed its victims. The ocean making no distinction between those who served by choice and those who served by force. The enslaved sailors who worked the coastal trade, the river commerce, the fishing fleets of the South. They faced all the dangers of the sea with none of the choice that free sailors had about whether to accept the risks. The reality of dangerous work during slavery was that enslaved people were often deliberately assigned to the most hazardous tasks precisely because their lives were valued less than the lives of free workers. When there was a choice between risking an enslaved worker or a free white worker, the calculation was brutally simple. Enslaved workers could be replaced more easily. Their deaths involved less legal complication. Their families had no recourse in the courts. Irish immigrants working alongside enslaved labourers on canal projects sometimes found themselves given safer tasks, not because their employers cared about them as human beings, but because their deaths might cause problems, might invite lawsuits, might generate bad publicity that enslaved deaths did not. This calculus extended to the most dangerous moments of any job. When a tunnel needed someone to light the fuses that would trigger an explosion, the person chosen was often enslaved. When a mine shaft needed to be tested after a collapse, the person who went down first was often enslaved. When a sugar boiler needed adjustment, at its most dangerous moment, the hands that reached into the works were often enslaved hands. The system sorted workers by the value of their lives, and enslaved lives were always worth less in that calculation, always expendable in ways that free lives were not. Some enslavers hired out their enslaved workers to dangerous industries rather than using them in such work directly, collecting fees while transferring the risk to others. The hiring system was widespread in the antebellum South, a way for enslavers to profit from workers they didn't need for their own operations, a way for industries that needed labor to access it without the capital investment of purchase. But the hiring system created a perverse incentive structure that made dangerous work even more deadly. The person who owned an enslaved worker wasn't the same person who worked them, so the hirer had no long-term interest in the worker's survival. A hired worker could be pushed to exhaustion, could be used in the most dangerous tasks, could be effectively worked to death, and the only consequence for the hirer was paying the owner for the property that had been damaged or destroyed. The payment was often less than the profit that had been extracted from the worker before their death or disabling injury. The system externalized the costs of dangerous work onto enslaved bodies, while concentrating the profits in white hands, creating incentives that virtually guaranteed maximum exploitation and minimal care. Some hirers were notorious for the condition in which they returned workers: the bodies broken, the health destroyed, the lives shortened by work that had been profitable precisely because it was so destructive. The contracts that governed hiring often included clauses about compensation for death or injury, putting dollar figures on the loss of limbs, on permanent disability, on death itself. These contracts reveal the cold economic logic that governed enslaved lives, the way that human beings were reduced to assets whose damage or destruction could be calculated and compensated like any other business loss. An arm might be worth $100. A life might be worth the remaining value of the enslaved person's expected productivity. The numbers negotiated between enslavers and hirers without any input from the people whose bodies were being priced. The injuries that didn't kill still marked bodies for life, becoming records of labor written in flesh that could never be erased. The missing fingers and hands of sugar workers caught in machinery that pulled faster than human reflexes could respond. The scarred faces and arms of iron workers burned by molten metal that splashed and spattered despite every precaution. The bent backs of rice workers, shaped by years of stooping in water. The spines curved into permanent testimony of the work they had done. The damaged lungs of miners and turpentine workers struggling for breath that never came easily again. The air, passages scarred by dust and chemicals that had accumulated over years of exposure. These injuries were visible evidence of what slavery demanded and what enslaved people endured. They were markers of survival, proof that the person bearing them had lived through dangers that killed others. But they were also disabilities that could make further work difficult or impossible, that could transform workers who had been valuable into workers who were surplus, who were sold away from families because they could no longer produce, who were neglected until they died because they no longer justified the cost of maintaining them. The injuries that slavery inflicted continued to exact their toll long after the immediate wounds had healed, shaping lives and limiting futures for as long as the injured survived. The resistance to dangerous work was constant, if often invisible, woven into the daily lives of people who had no formal power to refuse but who found ways to protect themselves nonetheless. Enslaved workers slowed the pace when possible, took breaks when overseers weren't watching, found moments of rest within the relentless demands of dangerous labor. They shared knowledge about how to survive, passing down techniques for avoiding the worst hazards, warning newcomers about dangers that experience had revealed, creating informal systems of mutual protection within workplaces designed to atomize and control them. They supported injured workers when they could, covering for colleagues who needed rest, sharing food with those too hurt to work, maintaining the bonds of community that made survival possible. They created small spaces of solidarity within systems designed to isolate them, finding ways to care for each other despite rules that prohibited such care, despite punishments that threatened anyone who put human connection above production. The survival of so many people through such dangerous conditions was itself a form of resistance, a refusal to be destroyed despite everything the system threw at them, a stubborn insistence on living that defied the calculations of those who considered them expendable. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, think about the workers in the sugar houses, watching the kettles through exhausted eyes, knowing that a moment's lapse could mean scalding death. Think about the miners descending into shafts that might become their tombs, the rice workers standing in water that carried disease, the construction workers blasting through mountains with unstable explosives, the loggers riding logs through rapids where death waited in every eddy. Think about what it meant to have no choice about these risks, to be compelled into danger by a system that valued production over human life, to face each day knowing that the work might kill you and that your death would be recorded as a property loss rather than a human tragedy. But think also about survival, about the millions who lived through these dangers, who carried the scars and the damage but kept living, who found ways to endure conditions that should have been unendurable. Think about the knowledge they passed down, the techniques for survival, the ways of protecting oneself and one's community within systems designed to destroy. Think about the resistance embedded in every act of survival, the refusal to be consumed entirely, the insistence on humanity in the face of treatment designed to deny it. The dangerous work of slavery tried to reduce human beings to fuel for industry, to disposable inputs in economic processes. It failed. The people survived, remembered, and their descendants are still here, still telling the stories, still refusing to let the history be forgotten. Let that persistence carry you into peaceful sleep. Congratulations. You've just been handed your freedom. The year is somewhere in the 1870s, and the chains are officially off. The Emancipation Proclamation has been signed. The war is over. The Confederacy is dust. You're no longer property. You're a citizen now, at least on paper. The good news is you can't be bought and sold anymore. The bad news is you have nothing. No land, no money, no tools, no mule, no education, because teaching you to read was illegal for your entire life up until about 5 minutes ago. And you're standing in the same place you've always been, looking at the same fields you've always worked, and the man who used to own you is offering you a deal. You can stay, work the land. He'll provide the cabin, the seeds, the equipment. You keep a share of what you grow, and he takes the rest. It sounds almost reasonable when he explains it. What he doesn't mention is the mathematics of the arrangement. which are designed so that you'll never, ever get ahead. Welcome to sharecropping. It's not slavery. It's something more insidious. It's slavery with a receipt. So you take the deal because there's no other deal to take. The 40 acres and a mule that were promised never materialized. The Freedmen's Bureau is underfunded and overwhelmed. The North has moved on to other concerns, leaving you in the hands of the same people who spent the last few centuries treating you as livestock. You sign a contract you can't read, and suddenly, you're a sharecropper. Your new home is waiting for you at the edge of the cotton field. It's a cabin, they call it, though cabin is generous. It's more like a wooden box that someone assembled in a hurry and then forgot about. Single room, dirt floor. Walls made of rough-hewn planks with gaps wide enough to see daylight through. The chia roof is a patchwork of wooden shingles, some of them already curling upward, already surrendering to the weather. There's no glass in the windows because glass costs money. Just openings covered with wooden shutters that don't quite fit their frames. One door that swings on leather hinges and doesn't latch properly. This is where you'll live. This is where you'll raise your family. This is where you'll try to survive when the temperature drops and the wind starts to howl. Let's talk about that cold, because the South isn't the tropical paradise some people imagine. When winter settles over the Mississippi Delta or the Alabama Black Belt, the temperature can plunge below freezing for weeks at a time. The humidity makes it worse. Cold air heavy with moisture cuts through fabric like it isn't there, settles into joints, makes every breath feel like swallowing ice water. You wake up in your cabin and your breath hangs visible in front of your face. The water in the bucket by the door has a skin of ice on it. The dirt floor feels like a frozen pond beneath your feet. And those gaps in the walls you noticed in summer, the ones that let in a nice breeze when you were sweating through the cotton harvest, now they're funneling Arctic wind directly into your home. Every crack is a wound in the structure, and the cold bleeds through relentlessly. You stuff rags into the gaps. You paste newspaper over the holes if you can find any newspaper. You hang quilts on the walls like tapestries, trying to create some barrier between your family and the elements. It's not enough. It's never enough. Here's where the ingenuity starts, because black sharecroppers weren't passive victims waiting to freeze. They were problem solvers operating with almost no resources, and they developed techniques for surviving winter that got passed down through generations. The first rule was simple. Seal everything you can. Those cracks in the walls weren't just uncomfortable. They were potentially lethal. So families mixed mud with straw and whatever else was available, creating a crude plaster they could smear over the worst gaps. It looked terrible. It crumbled and had to be reapplied constantly. But it blocked the wind, at least partially, at least for a while. The gaps around windows and doors got special attention. Rags, old clothing, strips of burlap, anything that could be wedged into a crack became insulation. Some families collected Spanish moss from the trees and stuffed it into wall cavities, creating a layer of natural padding between themselves and the outside air. The smell was musty and strange, but warmth was more important than aesthetics. The fireplace was the heart of everything. If your cabin had one, and most did, because even landlords understood you couldn't work their fields if you froze to death, then that fireplace became the center of your entire existence from November through February. The fire had to stay lit. Letting it die meant starting from scratch with numb fingers and damp kindling, assuming you had kindling at all. And starting a fire without matches, which cost money, meant using flint and steel, or rubbing sticks together, or borrowing a coal from a neighbor's hearth, if you were lucky enough to have neighbors close by. Banking the coals at night became a sacred ritual. You'd pile ashes over the glowing embers just before sleep, insulating them, keeping them alive through the dark hours. The technique required precision. Too much ash and you'd smother the coals completely. Too little and they'd burn out before dawn. Getting it right meant waking to warmth instead of having to start from nothing with frozen hands. In the morning, you'd rake back the ash carefully, add some dry leaves or pine needles, blow gently until the flames caught again. It was a daily resurrection, a small miracle performed out of necessity. Children learned this skill early, watching parents and grandparents tend the fire, understanding without being told that the fire was life itself. The fire provided heat, obviously, but it also provided light in cabins where candles were luxuries and kerosene for lamps was yet another expense. It provided the means to cook whatever food you had. It provided a gathering point, a place where the family could huddle together and remember that they were still alive when the wind howled outside and the temperature dropped and the darkness pressed against those thin walls like something trying to get in. Children did their homework by firelight, learning letters and numbers in the flickering glow, squinting at pages because the light was never quite enough. Elders told stories while staring into the flames, passing down memories of Africa, of slavery, of the relatives who didn't make it, of the ones who escaped north and were never heard from again. The fire was more than warmth. It was continuity. It was the thread connecting past to present to future. It was proof that your family was still together, still fighting, still refusing to be extinguished. But here's the thing about fireplaces in sharecropper cabins. They were inefficient by design because nobody was spending money to make poor black families comfortable. The chimneys were often built wrong, drawing heat up and out rather than radiating it into the room. The hearths were too small for the spaces they were meant to heat. And the wood, well, the wood was whatever you could scrounge. The landlord might let you collect deadfall from his property, or he might not. Some landowners charged sharecroppers for firewood, adding it to the eternal debt that kept families trapped. Others simply didn't care if their workers froze, figuring there were always more desperate people to replace the ones who died. So you walked the edges of fields and forests, gathering branches, dragging fallen limbs back to your cabin, hoping you had enough to get through the night. Green wood that hissed and smoked because it hadn't dried properly. Rotten wood that burned too fast and gave off little heat. Pine that crackled pleasantly but disappeared in hours. You took what you could get and you made it work. Now let's talk about the beds, because sleep was both an escape and a challenge. Most sharecropper families didn't have proper beds in any sense a modern person would recognize. What they had were pallets, simple mattresses stuffed with corn husks or cotton scraps or Spanish moss, laid directly on the dirt floor or raised slightly on wooden frames if someone had the skills and materials to build them. The stuffing compacted over time, getting thinner and harder, until you were essentially sleeping on a fabric-covered board that offered no cushion and precious little insulation. The corn husks crackled when you moved, announcing every shift of position to everyone else in the cabin, making restless nights a communal experience whether anyone wanted that or not. The cold rose up from the earth like a living thing, with intentions, seeping through whatever barrier you'd constructed between yourself and the ground, finding its way into your hip bones and your spine, and settling there like it planned to stay forever. Smart families learned to layer. Quilts beneath you as well as above. Old newspapers under the pallet as insulation. Anything to create separation from that frozen dirt floor. The quilts themselves were works of art born from necessity. Women stitched them from whatever fabric scraps they could accumulate. Old clothes too worn to wear anymore, flour sacks, bits of cotton left over from the harvest. The patterns weren't just decorative. They were efficient, designed to maximize warmth by trapping air in multiple layers. A good quilt could mean the difference between shivering through the night and actually resting. Some families had quilts that had been passed down for generations, the stitching repaired and reinforced by each successive owner, the fabric soft from decades of use. Sleeping arrangements in winter followed a strict logic of body heat. The children slept in the middle, surrounded by adults. The elderly and the sick got positions closest to whatever warmth existed. Babies slept pressed against their mothers, skin to skin under the blankets. It wasn't about privacy or comfort. It was about pooling resources, using human bodies as heat generators, creating a collective warmth that no individual could produce alone. On the coldest nights, even the family dog might be invited onto the bed, its body adding precious degrees to the human pile. Personal space was a luxury for people who had enough blankets to sleep alone. Sharecroppers had each other, and that had to be enough. Let's talk about clothing now, because what you wore determined whether you lived or died. Most sharecropper families had what could generously be called a limited wardrobe. You might have one set of clothes for working and one set for church, if you were fortunate. The working clothes were patched and repatched until the patches had patches, the fabric thin from washing, the seams held together by prayer and thread that was itself too precious to waste. When winter came, you layered everything you owned on top of everything else you owned and hoped for the best. Men wore overalls over long underwear over whatever shirts they could scrounge. The cotton fabric never quite thick enough to stop the wind, the buttons often missing and replaced with safety pins or bits of wire. Women wore multiple skirts and dresses simultaneously, each layer adding a thin barrier against the cold, the hems dragging in mud and freezing stiff by the end of the day. Aprons doubled as shawls, shawls doubled as head coverings. Everything served multiple purposes because nothing could afford to serve just one. Children wore hand-me-downs that had been handed down so many times the original wearer was a family legend, a name invoked with something like reverence. This was your great-uncle's shirt. Your grandmother wore this dress when she was your age. The clothes carried history along with patches, connecting children to ancestors they'd never met, making them understand they were part of something larger than themselves. The garments were often the wrong size, too big or too small, adjusted with pins and creative tailoring that never quite worked. Children grew out of clothes faster than clothes could be obtained, so they wore what was available and learned not to complain. Some winters there simply wasn't enough to go around. Siblings shared coats, taking turns going outside, one staying by the fire while the other did chores in the cold. Shoes were particularly precious and particularly inadequate. Many sharecropper children went barefoot until the cold made it genuinely dangerous, their feet tough from a summer of running through fields and over dirt roads. But no amount of toughness could protect against frozen ground and frost. The shoes they finally received were often too small or too large, purchased second-hand from someone who had finished with them, or handed down from older siblings whose feet had stretched the leather in ways that didn't match the new wearer. The shoes were stuffed with rags or newspaper to make them fit, to add a layer of insulation between feet and frozen ground. Cardboard inserted into worn-out soles, replaced every few days as it disintegrated from moisture. Socks were darned and redarned until they were more repair than original material. The heels and toes reinforced so many times they formed thick lumps that rubbed blisters, And still, frostbite happened. Still, children developed chilblains, those painful swellings that came from repeated exposure to cold, their feet aching and itching as they warmed by the fire each evening. Still, families huddled together and waited for spring, counting the days, pretending the cold didn't hurt as much as it did. The ingenuity extended to materials that would seem bizarre to modern eyes. Newspaper appeared everywhere in sharecropper winter survival. Sheets of it were layered under clothing for insulation, pressed against skin beneath shirts. It lined the insides of shoes, replacing proper insoles. It covered walls, blocking drafts. It stuffed cracks around windows and doors. Newspaper was free or nearly free, available from anyone who had already read it, and it worked remarkably well as an insulator because of the trapped air between layers. The ink sometimes transferred to skin, leaving people with newsprint tattoos that lasted until their next bath, which might not be for weeks given how cold the water was. But ink on skin was nothing compared to warmth in the body, so nobody complained. Feed sacks became clothing, flour sacks became quilts. Burlap became everything from wall insulation to shoe padding. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be afforded to be wasted. Food in winter presented its own set of challenges. The growing season was over. Whatever you'd managed to put up during the harvest would have to last until spring, and the harvest hadn't been good, because the harvest was never good when you were giving most of it to someone else. Sharecroppers survived the cold months on a diet that was monotonous, inadequate, and sometimes barely sufficient to sustain life. The 3 M's, they called it: meat, meal, and molasses. That was the foundation of winter eating, repeated day after day, until you couldn't stand the sight of any of it, but ate anyway, because the alternative was not eating at all. Salt pork was the centerpiece of many meals, fatty and preserved to the point of toughness, providing calories if not nutrition. It came in barrels from the landlord's commissary, bought on credit that would come due at settlement time, added to the endless debt that kept families trapped generation after generation. The pork was often rancid by late winter, the fat yellowed and sharp smelling, but you cooked it anyway, because fat was fuel, and your body needed fuel to generate heat. Cornmeal appeared in every possible form, as bread, as mush, as fried cakes, as thickener for whatever watery soup was available, as the base for meals that had no business being called meals, but kept bodies moving anyway. You learned 100 ways to prepare cornmeal, because learning 99 wasn't enough to get through the winter without wanting to scream. Cornbread with crackling, if you had pork fat to spare. Hoe cakes cooked on a flat iron over the fire. Corn mush that slid down your throat and sat heavy in your stomach, making you feel full even when you weren't nourished. Dried beans when you had them, soaked overnight and cooked for hours until they softened into something edible, stretched with water and seasoned with whatever was available, which was usually nothing more than salt. Molasses for sweetness and energy, spooned over cornbread or mixed into coffee. There wasn't really coffee, but some roasted grain substitute, because actual coffee was a luxury. The sweetness helped, psychologically if nothing else. A spoonful of molasses could make a child smile on a morning when there was little else to smile about. Collard greens, if you'd planted them early enough and they'd survived the first frost. If you'd had the foresight to plant them at all when every spare minute was devoted to the cash crop that the landlord demanded. The greens were important because they were one of the few sources of vitamins available during the lean months. But they were also bitter and tough and had to be cooked for hours to become edible, simmered with a piece of salt pork until they finally surrendered. turnips stored in root cellars, if you had a root cellar, which most sharecroppers didn't, because building one required time and materials that weren't available. Sweet potatoes buried in straw and hope, some of them rotting before you could eat them, some of them lasting until February if you were lucky. Pork fat went into everything because fat was essential. Your body burned it for warmth. Without enough fat, you shivered no matter how many quilts you piled on, no matter how close you huddled to the fire. The economics of winter eating were brutal. Whatever you'd earned from your share of the cotton crop, assuming you'd earned anything at all after the landlord deducted for rent, for tools, for seeds, for the credit you'd taken at his store during planting season, that money had to stretch from settlement day in late autumn until the next crop came in the following fall. It never stretched far enough. Families went hungry. Children ate less, so adults could maintain the strength to work. Adults ate less, so children could have enough to grow. The arithmetic of deprivation was constant and inescapable. By February, the stores were often empty. By March, people were foraging, looking for anything edible in the still frozen landscape. Hunting helped when it was allowed, which it often wasn't. Fishing helped when the water wasn't frozen. But mostly, people just endured, their bodies consuming themselves to stay warm, counting the days until the earth softened and something could grow again. Here's where the community came in, because individual families couldn't survive alone, and everyone knew it. The sharecropper quarters, those clusters of cabins on the edges of plantations, developed their own social structures, their own systems of mutual aid that existed outside and often in defiance of the official economy that kept them trapped. When one family ran out of food, another family shared what they had, even when what they had wasn't enough for their own table. When one cabin's roof collapsed under the weight of ice or gave way to wind damage, neighbors helped repair it, contributing labor and materials they could barely spare because they knew their own roof might be next. When someone got sick, others took over their work so they could rest without losing their position, without giving the landlord an excuse to replace them with someone hungrier and more desperate. This wasn't charity in the modern sense, wasn't something done from surplus for those in deficit. It was survival strategy, the understanding that your neighbor's downfall could easily be your own, that the whole community stood or fell together. The community also gathered for warmth, literally pooling body heat when individual resources ran low. On the coldest nights, multiple families might crowd into one cabin, combining their firewood, their body heat, their quilts. The cabin would be packed to the point of discomfort. Bodies everywhere, children sleeping in laps and corners, adults sitting up through the night because there wasn't enough floor space to lie down. The air would grow thick with breath and the smell of unwashed bodies, but everyone would be warmer than they would have been alone in their own freezing cabins. These gatherings often turned into impromptu social events, people making the best of necessity, telling stories and singing songs to pass the time, the children falling asleep to the sound of adult voices sharing memories and making plans for spring. The warmth was as much emotional as physical. The comfort of community in circumstances designed to isolate and break. Churches served as gathering points during winter, not just for spiritual sustenance, but for physical warmth and social connection. A Sunday service meant hours in a heated building, surrounded by community, singing songs that generated body heat, moving with the Spirit in ways that kept blood flowing. The church was often the best-built structure available to black sharecroppers, constructed with care and maintained with pride, representing the one space they actually controlled. It had a proper stove or fireplace, windows that closed properly, a roof that didn't leak. Spending time there was spending time in something like comfort, a temporary escape from the cabins where survival was always in question. The all-day meetings that characterized black Southern churches weren't just religious tradition. They were survival practice, keeping people warm and fed and connected during the hardest months. Dinner on the grounds meant shared food, potluck meals, where everyone contributed what they could, stretching resources further than any single family could manage alone. The spiritual fed people's souls, while the physical fed their bodies, and both kinds of nourishment were necessary to make it through. The children adapted in ways that would break your heart if you thought about them too carefully. They learned to ignore the cold, because complaining didn't help, and made adults more stressed than they already were. They learned to move constantly, running and jumping and playing not just for fun, but because motion generated warmth, because sitting still meant feeling the cold settle into bones, like something permanent. They learned to share sleeping, space without complaint, to wear 2 big shoes stuffed with newspaper without embarrassment, to eat whatever was put in front of them and be grateful, even when grateful was the last thing they felt. They learned that winter was something to be endured, not enjoyed, a season of scarcity that would eventually pass if you just held on long enough. Their games reflected their reality, pretend versions of the work they'd soon be doing for real, practice for the lives that stretched ahead of them like the field stretched toward every horizon. Some of them got sick anyway. The cold, combined with malnutrition, combined with inadequate medical care, meant that every winter carried off some of the weakest. Pneumonia was common and often fatal. It started with a cough, a fever, a child who couldn't get warm no matter how many quilts were piled on. Without antibiotics, without doctors who would treat black patients, without hospitals that would admit them, families could only watch and pray and apply whatever folk remedies had been passed down through generations. Onion poultices on the chest, whiskey and honey for the throat, steam from boiling water, though water was precious and couldn't be wasted. Sometimes the remedies worked, often they didn't. Influenza swept through the quarters with depressing regularity, moving from cabin to cabin because isolation was impossible when survival required closeness. Children who survived into adulthood carried memories of siblings who didn't, of funerals held in frozen ground, of tiny coffins built from scrap wood, of grief layered onto hardship, layered onto exhaustion. Every winter was a gauntlet, and not everyone made it through. Let's talk about what the landlords were doing while their workers froze. Some of them were in their plantation houses, warm and well-fed, barely aware of conditions in the quarters beyond a general sense that labor was available when needed. The big house had fireplaces in every room, proper windows with actual glass, cellars stocked with preserved food, wardrobes full of wool coats and leather boots. The distance between landlord and sharecropper could be measured in miles of dirt road, but it might as well have been measured in centuries. The two groups lived in the same geographic space, but entirely different worlds. Some landlords provided minimal assistance to their workers during winter, understanding that a dead sharecropper couldn't work the spring planting. They might distribute some firewood, some corn, some salt pork, just enough to keep bodies alive until they were needed again. This wasn't generosity. It was farm management, the same logic that kept mules fed and equipment maintained. Other landlords did nothing at all, figuring that if this year's sharecroppers died, next year's would arrive desperate enough to accept the same terms. The callousness was sometimes deliberate, sometimes simply the result of never thinking about workers as fully human. Either way, the result was suffering that could have been prevented by slightly more equitable arrangements. The psychological weight of winter was as heavy as the physical burden. For people who had recently been enslaved, who remembered or had heard stories of the Middle Passage and the auction block and the whip, who had been told that freedom would mean a new life, and then discovered that freedom looked remarkably like the old one, winter represented another broken promise. They had survived so much already. The fact that they now had to survive this too, in cabins they didn't own, on land they'd never possess, working for people who saw them as little more than labor units, was a special kind of cruelty. The cold wasn't neutral. It was inflicted. It was the result of specific decisions by specific people who could have done differently but chose not to. Some sharecroppers channeled this understanding into determination. If they were meant to freeze, they would refuse. If they were meant to die, they would live out of spite. The same resilience that had carried their ancestors through the horrors of slavery would carry them through this. They would bank their fires and patch their walls and share their quilts and sing their songs and emerge on the other side of winter still standing. Religion played a central role in this endurance. The black church wasn't just a place to worship. It was a source of hope in circumstances that offered little reason for hope. Preachers spoke of deliverance, of trials that would end, of a promised land that might not exist in this life but certainly waited in the next. The songs that filled those churches carried the same double meanings they'd carried in slavery times. Soon I will be done with the troubles of the world wasn't just about heaven. It was about getting through to spring, getting through another year, getting through to some imagined future where things might finally be different. The faith wasn't passive. It was active resistance against despair, a declaration that circumstances didn't have the final word. When an elderly woman sat by a dying fire and said that the Lord would provide, she wasn't being naive. She was refusing to surrender to the obvious conclusion that nobody was providing anything. That refusal kept people alive. And slowly, incredibly, spring would come. The days would lengthen almost imperceptibly at first. A few extra minutes of light that you might not even notice until suddenly you realized you could see your work clearly, when before you'd been straining in dimness. The ice on the water bucket would thin and then disappear. The frozen ground would soften enough for ploughing, first just the top layer, then deeper as the sun grew stronger. The children would stop coughing, their bodies finally able to heal now that they weren't spending all their energy just staying warm. The buds would appear on trees. The early wildflowers would push through last year's dead leaves, and something like hope would stir in chests that had been tight with coal for months. The cycle would begin again, planting and tending and harvesting and settling up with the landlord and coming up short and starting over. But at least it wouldn't be cold. At least for a few months, the enemy would be heat exhaustion, rather than hypothermia, the blazing sun instead of the cutting wind. Spring brought its own challenges, of course. The work intensified as planting season demanded every available hour of every available hand. The debts accumulated during winter had to be addressed. The credit extended at the commissary added to the running tab that never seemed to decrease no matter how hard you worked. But spring also brought fresh food, greens sprouting in gardens, eggs from chickens who'd stopped laying during the cold months, fish from streams no longer locked under ice. The diet improved even as the labor increased, and bodies that had been slowly consuming themselves through winter began to rebuild. Children who'd been listless with cold and hunger ran through fields with something like energy, their laughter carrying across the warm air, their survival confirmed for another year. Survival meant making it through one season, to face the next one, and the next one after that, until something changed, or you died trying to change it. For many sharecroppers, the change never came. They spent their entire lives in the same cabins, on the same land, working for the same families who'd owned their parents, the promise of freedom hollowed out by economics that made escape nearly impossible. The debt you owed at settlement time meant you couldn't leave until it was paid. The debt was designed never to be paid. You worked the land because you had no choice, and your children worked it after you, and their children after them. The same fields passing from generation to generation, with nothing to show for all that labor but worn-out bodies and early graves. But many sharecroppers eventually left. The Great Migration that pulled millions of black Southerners northward was driven partly by violence, by the lynchings, and the constant threat of white terrorism. It was driven partly by the boll weevil that destroyed cotton crops and made sharecropping even less viable than it had already been. And it was driven partly by winter, by the knowledge that in Chicago or Detroit, or New York at least, the cold would be expected, planned for, with housing built to withstand it, and jobs that paid actual wages instead of shares of a crop you never owned. The migrants carried their survival skills with them, the knowledge of how to make do with nothing, how to stretch a dollar, how to find warmth in community when the world outside was frozen and hostile. They carried their faith and their music and their determination, and they built new lives in cities that didn't necessarily want them, but couldn't ultimately stop them. The cabins they left behind rotted and collapsed, returned to the earth, leaving barely a trace of the families who had fought so hard to survive within their thin walls. The fields grew over with weeds and then trees, nature reclaiming what had been worked by human hands for generations. By the mid-20th century, many of those plantation quarters had simply disappeared, as if the suffering that happened there had been erased along with the structures. But before they left, and for those who stayed, the winters continued to come. Year after year, generation after generation, black sharecroppers faced the cold with whatever they had, which was never enough, and somehow made it work anyway. They banked their fires and patched their walls. They quilted and layered and huddled. They shared what they couldn't afford to share because sharing was how everyone survived. They told stories by firelight, sang songs in cold churches, prayed prayers that were really acts of defiance. They buried their dead in frozen ground and continued living because the alternative was unthinkable. The techniques they developed, the wisdom they accumulated, the sheer stubborn refusal to give in, all of it represented a kind of genius that rarely gets recognized. Not the genius of invention or discovery, but the genius of endurance. The ability to look at impossible circumstances and find a way through anyway. Tonight, as you settle into your warm bed in your heated home, spare a thought for those who came before. The families who slept 5 to a pallet under quilts made from scraps. The children who ran to keep warm because there wasn't enough firewood. The mothers who gave up their portions so their babies could eat. The fathers who walked miles through snow to gather deadfall branches. The grandparents who remembered slavery and faced this new bondage with the same grim determination they'd always needed. They didn't just survive the brutal southern winters. They survived them while being systematically denied the resources that would have made survival easier. They survived them while building communities and raising children and maintaining hope. They survived them while creating culture, music, traditions that would eventually reshape America. The cold tried to break them. It failed. It always failed. Because whatever else could be taken away, the will to continue could not be confiscated. The love that kept families together could not be frozen out. The faith that promised better days ahead could not be extinguished no matter how low the fire burned. So rest now. Let your breathing slow and your body relax into warmth that required no struggle to obtain. Think of the quilts stitched by candlelight, each square a small act of hope. Think of the fires carefully banked, the coals protected through the night like precious cargo. Think of the songs rising from cold churches, voices creating warmth through sheer volume and conviction. Think of the children who became ancestors, who passed down not just survival techniques but survival itself, the unbroken chain of living that connects those frozen cabins to wherever you are right now. Their winters were brutal, their resources scarce, their circumstances designed for failure. And they made it through anyway. They always made it through. That's the story that doesn't get told enough. The heroism that doesn't make the history books. The genius that gets overlooked because it looks like mere survival rather than something more dramatic. But survival was the most dramatic thing of all. It was the victory that made every other victory possible. And tonight, let the memory of their endurance carry you into peaceful sleep, warm and safe and grateful for everything they overcame so that you could be here to remember them. Congratulations, you've just arrived in Harlem in 1926. You're young, hopeful, and absolutely exhausted from the 6-day work week that just ended. Your hands are rough from labor, your shoes are worn thin, and your wallet holds exactly enough for rent, food, and maybe one night of forgetting how hard everything is. The good news is that tonight is Saturday, and Harlem on a Saturday night is the closest thing to magic you've ever seen. The bad news is that finding someone to share that magic with is going to be an adventure all its own. You've heard the stories about Harlem, read the poems, maybe seen photographs of elegant couples in sharp suits and shimmering dresses. The Harlem Renaissance, they're calling it. A flowering of black art and culture and possibility. And that's real. That's happening all around you. But here's the thing about renaissances. They don't pay your rent. They don't introduce you to someone who'll stick around past sunrise. The glamour you've heard about exists in narrow slices, and the rest is just people like you trying to figure out how to live, how to love, and how to do both without losing your footing in a city that would just as soon swallow you whole. Let's start with the basics. You want to meet someone. You want romance, or at least you want something that feels like it. Maybe you're fresh up from the South, one of the hundreds of thousands who've made the great migration north, chasing factory jobs and freedom from Jim Crow. Maybe you were born here, watching your neighborhood transform as wave after wave of newcomers arrive, filling every available room, every hallway, every corner. Either way, you're looking for connection in a place bursting with people and somehow still impossibly lonely. The first problem is practical. Where exactly do you meet someone? Harlem in the 20s is dense, vibrant, and overwhelmingly public. Privacy is a luxury most can't afford. Your apartment, if you can call it that, is a single room shared with family members or boarders. The walls are thin enough to hear your neighbors' arguments, their prayers, their creaking bed springs. Bringing someone home to court them properly requires choreography. That would exhaust a dance troupe. Your landlady watches everyone who comes and goes. Your mother, if she's still with you, has opinions about every person you speak to. Courting under the gaze of a dozen witnesses isn't exactly romantic. It's a performance, and everyone's a critic. So you take it to the streets, literally. 7th Avenue on a Saturday evening is a promenade, a living showcase of Harlem style and ambition. You put on your best clothes, which means the clothes you've carefully maintained, pressed with a borrowed iron, mended in spots that hopefully don't show. The men wear suits if they have them, 3 pieces if they're doing well, 2 if they're managing, shirt and tie if that's all they've got. The women wear dresses that catch the light from the street lamps, hats perched at angles that took 20 minutes to perfect. You walk slowly, deliberately, making yourself visible, hoping to catch someone's eye. The preparation itself is a ritual. You've been thinking about tonight since Wednesday, planning what you'll wear, how you'll style your hair. If you're a woman, you might spend an hour with a hot comb, the smell of burning hair, and Madam C.J. Walker's pressing oil filling the room. The process is painful, the comb too hot against your scalp. But the result is sleek waves that say you've made an effort, that you take yourself seriously. If you're a man, you've visited the barbershop, that sanctuary of masculine gossip where every romance in the neighborhood is discussed, dissected, and judged. The barber knows who's stepping out with whom, who got caught, who's looking. He'll tell you casually, while shaping your fade, that the woman you've been watching at church is apparently spoken for. Or he'll mention that someone's been asking about you. Information is currency, and the barbershop is the bank. Here's where it gets complicated. You can't just approach anyone on the street. There are rules, unwritten but ironclad. If a woman is walking with another woman, she might be approachable. But only if you've been properly introduced by someone she trusts, or if you're bold enough to risk the public rejection that could follow. If she's alone, she might be insulted that you'd think her the type to be approached by strangers. If she's with family, forget it. The labyrinth of propriety wraps around every interaction, and one wrong step can mark you as unsuitable for months. Your reputation travels faster than you do in a neighborhood this tight. The church helps if you're the church-going type. Sunday service isn't just about salvation. It's the original social network. The women sit on one side, the men on the other in many congregations, but afterward, on the steps, in the fellowship hall, during the potluck dinners that stretch into evening, you can actually talk. You can be introduced by a deacon who knows your family, vouched for by a grandmother who remembers where you came from. The church provides structure, context, legitimacy. It also provides surveillance. Every interaction is observed, evaluated, reported back. Your reputation is built or destroyed in whispered conversations between women who've known each other for decades. The church mothers are particularly formidable. These are the older women who've appointed themselves guardians of everyone's virtue, especially the young women's. They watch the pews like hawks, notice which young man is looking at which young woman, and file the information away. Later, at the potluck, one might sidle up to you and ask, with terrifying casualness, whether you've been saved, whether you have steady employment, whether your people come from good stock. This isn't small talk. This is an interview, and failing it means doors closing quietly but firmly throughout the congregation. But let's say you're not the church type, or maybe you are, but you're looking for something the church wouldn't approve of. Let's say you want to actually have fun. Welcome to the rent party, Harlem's most ingenious social invention, and the place where more romances probably began than any ballroom or church social. The rent party emerged from desperation and blossomed into something magnificent. Landlords in Harlem charged black tenants far more than white tenants paid elsewhere. A one-room apartment that might cost $8 a month downtown ran $24 in Harlem, if you were lucky. Working families couldn't always make rent, so they threw parties and charged admission. You hear about them through word of mouth, through flyers passed hand to hand, through cards tucked into mailboxes. The cards themselves were little works of art, hand-lettered invitations promising good music, good food, and good times. Tonight at Lucille's, 135th Street, apartment 4B. Music by the professor himself, chitlins and fish. 25 cents gets you in the door. You follow the directions to an ordinary tenement building, climb stairs that creak under the weight of everyone ascending, and push into a railroad apartment that's been transformed. The furniture is shoved against walls or taken out entirely. The kitchen is selling food, fried fish, potato salad, pig's feet if you're lucky, plates for 15 cents. The bedroom has become a bar, bottles of bootleg whiskey, gin that might be real or might strip paint, beer that's almost certainly watered down. And in the front room, pressed between strangers, you dance. The smell hits you first, cigarette smoke layered thick enough to make your eyes water. Perfume, cheap and expensive, and everything between, competing with the scent of frying fish from the kitchen. Sweat, because 50 people are crammed into a space meant for 5, and the August heat doesn't care about your comfort. Something sweet underneath it all. Maybe hair pomade, maybe spilled drink, maybe just the particular fragrance of Harlem itself on a Saturday night. You breathe it in and it becomes part of you, this smell, this atmosphere that can't be replicated or fully described. The music at a rent party is live, usually. A piano player in the corner, fingers flying, playing stride piano that makes the floor shake. Maybe a horn player joins, or a drummer keeping time on whatever surface is available. The sound is immediate, raw, nothing like the polished recordings you might hear from a phonograph. It fills the room, fills your chest, makes conversation almost impossible, which is fine, because you're not here to talk, you're here to move. The piano player might be someone famous, someone whose name you'll hear on records in a few years, or someone who'll never leave this neighborhood but can make a keyboard sing like nobody's business. Either way, right now, they're yours. Dancing is the courtship ritual of the era, and Harlem has elevated it to high art. The Charleston, the Black Bottom, the Lindy Hop just emerging, moves that require trust, coordination, and a willingness to let your body say what your mouth can't. You spot someone across the room. Your eyes meet. The negotiation happens in glances, in the slight turn of a shoulder, in the way someone angles toward you or away. If she angles toward you, you approach. You extend a hand. If she takes it, you dance. The first dance is an interview. Are you a good partner? Do you lead with confidence or clumsiness? Can you follow if the moment calls for it? Do you respect the rhythm, her rhythm, the rhythm you create together? A good dancer draws attention, and attention in this context is social currency. A bad dancer is remembered too, but not the way you want. Your body tells truths your words might hide. Stiffness suggests inexperience or nervousness. Too much flash suggests you're more interested in showing off than in your partner. The sweet spot is somewhere in between. Confident but attentive. Skilled but generous. The sweat is unavoidable. The room is packed, the air thick with cigarette smoke and perfume, and the press of bodies. Your shirt soaks through within the first hour. Your feet ache. Your lungs burn from the smoke. But you keep moving, because stopping means standing awkwardly at the edge of a room where everyone else is alive with motion. Besides, the exhaustion is part of it. Dancing until you can barely stand means you've given yourself completely to the night, and there's something romantic in that kind of surrender. If the dancing goes well, you might talk during a break. You buy her a drink from the makeshift bar. The gin burns going down and tastes faintly of turpentine, but you smile anyway. You learn her name, where she works maybe. a laundress, a domestic, a seamstress if she's skilled, a waitress at one of the clubs if she's lucky. She learns your name. A porter, a janitor, a factory worker, a Pullman man if you're among the elite of working-class Harlem. You're both sizing each other up, calculating prospects, weighing stability against excitement. The arithmetic of romance in Harlem involves numbers, always numbers. How much do you make? How much do you owe? How much could we make together? And here's where the romance of the era collides with its realities. You're not just looking for attraction, you're looking for survival. Marriage in Harlem wasn't primarily about love. It was about economics. 2 incomes were better than 1. A partner who could cook stretched the budget further. Someone who could sew kept clothes wearable longer. The practical considerations sat right alongside the romantic ones, often overshadowing them entirely. That doesn't mean love wasn't part of it. It means love had to fight for space among all the other demands. Let's talk about those demands. The work week consumed most of your waking hours. 6 days a week, sometimes 7. 10-hour shifts, 12-hour shifts for domestic workers who lived with their employers downtown. You might see your sweetheart once a week, if you were lucky. Twice, if the stars aligned. Courting happened in the margins, the stolen hours between exhaustion and obligation. A Sunday afternoon walk through St. Nicholas Park. A Wednesday evening at the movies if you could both get free. The intensity of limited time made every meeting feel significant, which was both romantic and terrifying. Every date carried weight, because you didn't know when the next one would come. The movies were a particular refuge. The theaters on 125th Street offered darkness, anonymity, and something to do that didn't require much money or conversation. You could sit close to someone, let your shoulders touch, maybe hold hands if you were brave. The films themselves were silent, accompanied by a live pianist, and the stories unfolding on screen gave you something to discuss afterward. Did you see how she looked at him? What do you think happens after? The shared experience created intimacy without requiring much of the vulnerability that actual conversation demanded. And then there were the families. If you thought you were dating just one person, you were mistaken. You were dating their entire extended network. Her mother would ask around about your people. Where were you from? Who were your parents? What church did they attend? The investigation was thorough, and failing it could end things before they properly began. Coming from a good family meant something, even if that family was poor. It meant stability, respectability, a certain way of carrying yourself that signaled you weren't going to embarrass anyone. The South still mattered, even here. If your people came from the same region as her people, that was a point in your favor. Shared origins suggested shared values, or at least the illusion of them. Class distinctions within Harlem were sharp and ruthlessly observed. The so-called talented 10th, the professionals, the doctors and lawyers and teachers, the fair-skinned among them especially, they had their own social circles, their own parties, their own standards. They attended the formal affairs at the Renaissance Casino, the elegant dances where admission cost real money, and the dress code was strictly enforced. They looked down, often literally from their brownstone windows on Sugar Hill, at the working-class majority below. Dating across class lines wasn't impossible, but it raised eyebrows, created tensions, forced explanations that neither party necessarily wanted to give. Color consciousness threaded through everything. Lighter skin opened doors, conferred advantages, created hierarchies within the black community that echoed the larger society's prejudices. A paper bag test at some social clubs determined who could enter. Lighter than the bag, you were welcome. got darker, and the door remained closed. You could love whoever your heart chose, but the world around you had opinions about that choice, and those opinions had consequences. Mixed relationships within the black community itself were navigated carefully, silently, with awareness of the loaded meanings attached to skin tone. Nobody talked about it directly. Everybody understood. Let's step into a different venue now. You've saved up. Maybe you've been squirreling away nickels and dimes for weeks. Tonight, you're taking your sweetheart to a real club, one of the famous ones, the Cotton Club, or Connie's Inn, or Small's Paradise. The idea glitters with sophistication. The reality is more complicated. The Cotton Club, most famous of all, doesn't actually welcome you, not as a patron. That legendary venue, sitting right in the heart of Harlem, is whites only. The performers are black, the greatest musicians and dancers of the era, but the audience is white, wealthy, slumming uptown for a taste of exotic entertainment. You can work there, you can perform there, you can serve drinks there, but you can't sit down and enjoy the show. The irony burns, but you swallow it, because what else can you do? Small's Paradise is different. It welcomes black customers, and its waiters dance the Charleston while carrying trays, which is both spectacular and a reminder of how entertainment and service blur together when you're black in 1920s America. Here, you can actually sit, order food, watch the show, feel like you're part of the glamour you've heard so much about. But the prices require saving. A night out here costs what you'd spend feeding yourself for a week. You order carefully, nurse your drinks, calculate the tip while trying to look like you're not calculating anything. You want to seem at ease, like this is normal, like you belong among the well-dressed patrons and the sparkling performers. The speakeasies are another option. The illegal bars hiding behind unmarked doors, requiring passwords or knowing the right person. Prohibition is the law of the land, which means alcohol flows freely everywhere for those who know where to look. The drinks are unpredictable. Sometimes you get decent whiskey smuggled down from Canada. Sometimes you get bathtub gin that could double as cleaning fluid. You take your chances, grimace through the burn, and pretend you're sophisticated. The illegality adds a thrill, a sense that you're getting away with something, which makes for excellent date atmosphere, even when the atmosphere itself is a cramped basement reeking of smoke and spilled beer. Dating in Harlem meant navigating white spaces too, or more accurately, avoiding them. You couldn't take your sweetheart to most restaurants downtown. Hotels were out of the question. Even walking through certain neighborhoods invited trouble, stares at minimum, violence at worst. Your romantic geography was constrained by lines drawn before you were born, by a city that welcomed your labor, but not your presence. Harlem became everything because it had to be. It was where you were allowed to exist fully, where you could hold hands on the sidewalk without fearing what might happen. The boundaries were invisible but absolute, and every couple learned them quickly. Let's talk about what happened when things got serious. Courtship in Harlem followed patterns mostly. After enough dances, enough stolen conversations, enough Sunday walks, you were expected to make intentions clear. This wasn't casual dating in any modern sense. This was auditioning for marriage, and everyone knew it. A man who courted a woman for too long without proposing risked being labeled a time waster, a playboy, someone not to be trusted. A woman who allowed herself to be courted too long without securing a commitment risked being labeled fast, easy, damaged goods by the cruelest tongues. Engagement meant something serious because divorce was rare, shameful, and expensive. When you said yes, You were committing to something permanent, or at least intended to be. The pressure was immense. You were choosing a life partner based on relatively limited information. A few dozen supervised encounters, some dances, some walks, some carefully managed conversations. You were guessing about compatibility, about temperament, about whether this person would still be someone you wanted to wake up next to in 30 years. The gamble was enormous, and yet people made it, over and over, because what was the alternative? Loneliness seemed worse than risk. The wedding itself varied wildly depending on resources. Those with money had church ceremonies, white dresses, receptions in rented halls. Those without had simple ceremonies in living rooms, parties that blurred into rent parties, honeymoons that consisted of moving into an even smaller room together. The community showed up regardless, bearing gifts they couldn't afford, plates of food stretched thin, their presence the real offering. Marriage was a communal act, witnessed and supported by everyone who would later help when times got hard. And times would get hard. That was guaranteed. But what about before the wedding? Here's where the stories get quieter, more whispered. Premarital intimacy was officially forbidden, preached against from pulpits, gossiped about in scandalized tones, and it happened constantly. The mythology of Victorian morality persisted long after Victoria died, especially in public rhetoric. Private behavior was another matter entirely. Young couples found ways to be alone, stolen moments in stairwells, back rooms at parties, rooms borrowed from friends who looked the other way. The risks were enormous, especially for women. Pregnancy outside marriage meant shame, family disgrace, sometimes being cast out entirely. Contraception existed, but was unreliable and hard to obtain. Every intimate encounter was a gamble with consequences that fell disproportionately on women. Here's the thing about double standards. They were everywhere, enforced by everyone, and everyone knew they were unfair. A man who had multiple conquests was experienced. A woman who did the same was ruined. A man who delayed marriage was enjoying his freedom. A woman who did the same was getting old, desperate, past her prime. The rules didn't make sense, didn't pretend to be fair, and couldn't be openly challenged without social consequences. You learn to navigate them, to present one face publicly while living differently privately, to keep secrets that everyone suspected but nobody confirmed. The queer community navigated all this and more. Harlem in the 1920s was, by the standards of the era, remarkably open to gay and lesbian life. The drag balls at Hamilton Lodge drew thousands, with men in elaborate gowns competing for prizes, spectators of all orientations cheering. Buffet flats, private apartments where anything might happen, hosted mixed crowds seeking pleasures that couldn't be found elsewhere. Blues singers like Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith sang openly about loving women, their lyrics coded just enough to maintain deniability, but clear enough for those who understood. But openness was relative. What seemed tolerant compared to the rest of America was still dangerous. Police, raids happened, arrests happened, violence happened. Gay and lesbian Harlemites built lives, found love, created community, all while knowing that visibility could become vulnerability without warning. The numbers runners, the policy bankers, the hustlers who operated outside legal economies also operated outside conventional romance. For them, dating carried different meanings. A numbers runner flush with cash one day might be broke or arrested the next. The women who loved them, and there were many, loved something exciting and unstable, glamorous and dangerous. Gangsters threw money around, bought drinks for the house, dressed sharply, moved through Harlem like minor celebrities. They were catches, until they weren't. Until the violence caught up, the law caught up, the luck ran out. The widows they left behind were often young. Let's slow down now and remember the quieter romances, the ones that didn't happen in speakeasies or at rent parties, the ones that grew slowly between ordinary people doing ordinary things. A man and woman who worked at the same factory, nodding at each other for months before he finally found the courage to say good morning. A woman who noticed the same man at church every Sunday, gradually learning his name, his story, his hopes. These romances unfolded in small gestures. A shared umbrella during a sudden rain, an extra biscuit slipped onto someone's plate, a handkerchief offered and accepted and never returned because keeping it meant something neither of them could say aloud. Harlem created its own traditions around courtship. Certain corners became known as meeting spots. Certain barbershops and beauty parlors served as intelligence networks, spreading word about who was available, who was courting whom, who had just broken off an engagement. The community participated in everyone's love life, whether they wanted it to or not. Advice arrived unsolicited. Warnings came through third parties. Nothing was truly private, which meant support was always available, but so was judgment. The letters deserve mention. When words couldn't be spoken in person, they were written. Love letters passed between sweethearts too busy working to see each other, between separated families keeping romance alive across distance, between couples whose living situations made private conversation impossible. These letters were treasured, hidden in drawers, read and reread until the paper softened. They survive in archives now, fragments of feeling that outlasted the people who felt them. The handwriting cramped or flowing, the sentiments earnest, sometimes awkward, always achingly human. People who could barely afford paper spent their money on stationery, wanting their feelings to arrive on something worthy of what they contained. Photography played its part too. Portrait studios dotted Harlem, offering couples the chance to document themselves, to create evidence that they existed, that they mattered, that their love was real enough to be preserved. The photographs that survive show young couples posed formally, their expressions serious because smiling in photographs wasn't yet the norm. They wear their best clothes, sometimes borrowed for the occasion. They stand close, but rarely touching. Propriety observed even in private portraits. These images were displayed in frames, tucked into wallets, sent to family back south. "Look at us," they said. "Look what we've become." The music wrapped around everything. You couldn't separate romance from rhythm in 20s Harlem. The songs playing at every party, every club, every street corner provided the vocabulary for feelings. When you heard Bessie Smith moan about a man who'd done her wrong, you recognized something. When Louis Armstrong's trumpet soared, you felt something lift inside you that had nothing to do with words. The music gave permission to feel deeply in an era that demanded stoicism, that required black people especially to keep emotions guarded against a hostile world. In the music, in the dancing, you could let something loose. The blues especially spoke to heartbreak with an honesty that polite conversation couldn't allow. You could sit in a speakeasy and let a song cry for you. Let it say the things you couldn't admit in daylight. As the decade wore on, the cracks began showing. The stock market crash of 1929 hit Harlem hard, though Harlem had never been particularly prosperous to begin with. Jobs disappeared. Rent parties became more desperate, less celebratory. The glitter of the Renaissance tarnished as the Depression settled in. Dating changed when you couldn't afford the admission to anything, when survival consumed whatever energy romance required, when the future you were supposedly building together became impossible to imagine. Couples who might have married waited and waited and sometimes stopped waiting altogether. But people kept falling in love. That's the stubborn truth underneath all the hardship. Despite everything, or maybe because of everything, connections formed. Couples married, had children, built lives in tiny apartments, fought and reconciled and kept going. The romance wasn't in spite of the difficulty. It was woven through it, impossible to separate. You learned what love looked like when stripped of everything but itself. No fancy dates, no elaborate gifts, just two people choosing each other again and again, against considerable odds. And so, you imagine yourself there, at the end of a long Saturday night. The rent party is winding down. The piano player's fingers are finally slowing. The crowd thins as couples drift home, as the single and searching reluctantly give up for another week. You've met someone tonight, or maybe you haven't. Maybe tonight was just dancing and drinking and pretending the week's exhaustion doesn't exist. Maybe next Saturday, you'll try again. The walk home is warm, summer lingering in Harlem's narrow streets. Windows are open everywhere, releasing music, laughter, arguments into the night air. Somewhere a baby cries. Somewhere a couple murmurs on a fire escape, stealing a moment of privacy in a neighborhood where privacy doesn't exist. You think about what you're looking for and whether you'll find it. You think about the people who found each other here, against all odds, building something in a place that gave them little and demanded everything. They weren't heroes in any conventional sense. They were just people trying to feel less alone in a world that reminded them daily of how little they were valued. The romance of Harlem's jazz age wasn't about glamour, not really. It was about defiance. It was about insisting on joy in places designed to deny it. It was about two people looking at each other and deciding that this, whatever this was, mattered enough to fight for. So tonight, as you settle into your own bed, in your own time, with your own complications around love and connection, maybe spare a thought for those who danced in crowded apartments and whispered in church pews and wrote letters they hoped would say what they couldn't speak aloud. They were figuring it out as they went, same as you, same as everyone. The music has changed. The rules have shifted, but the fundamental search remains the same. Someone to see you, really see you. Someone to make the hard days bearable. Someone to dance with when the piano starts playing and the night promises something you can't quite name. They found it, some of them. Imperfectly, temporarily, against the odds. And the ones who didn't kept looking, kept showing up at parties and churches and street corners, kept believing that maybe next Saturday would be different. That stubborn hope is maybe the most romantic thing about any era. Not the glamour, not the music, just ordinary people refusing to give up on connection. The night settles over Harlem as it always does. The music fades to echoes. The streets empty slowly. And somewhere, in a window, you can't see from here, two people who found each other tonight are talking quietly, learning each other's stories, wondering if this might become something worth remembering. The lamplight flickers, the city breathes, and love, in all its complicated, inconvenient, necessary forms, keeps happening despite everything trying to prevent it. That's how it always goes. That's how it always will.